Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into a really interesting topic using the sources you sent us, articles, historical overviews, the works. We're charting a course through the history of Denmark.
That's right, from the very earliest times, prehistoric Denmark, right up to its place in the world today.
And we want to pull out the key insights, the turning points, and maybe some surprising facts from all this information. Make sense of it all for you.
And it's important to remember, right from the start, Denmark's story is tied to its geography. The coasts, the North Sea, its neighbors like Sweden and Norway, even how southern Sweden was apparently better for farming early on.
Yeah, that connection to the land and sea seems crucial. Okay, so our mission here is to navigate this complex history, cut through some of the detail, and give you a clear understanding of how Denmark evolved. Ready to dive in?
Let's do it. So if we go way, way back, the earliest signs of humans, we're talking right at the end of the last ice age. Hunter-gatherers basically following the melting ice north.
And then things start to change, don't they? Around 7,000 years ago, the sources show this hunter-gatherer culture becoming more distinct. Specialized tools, stone, bone.
Exactly. But then, almost simultaneously, you have farmers arriving, immigrants from the south bringing agriculture. And that leads to settled communities, a totally different way of life.
What's really striking, according to the research we looked at, is how fast this cultural shift happened.
Yeah, adopting farming, then metalworking, eventually literacy. It happened much, much faster than genetic changes in the population. It wasn't necessarily like one group completely replacing another.
Or like ideas and technology spreading.
Exactly. Cultural transmission. It shows how powerful that was even back then.
So to really understand this early period, you need to pull from everywhere, right? Archaeology, geology, linguistics.
Genetics, history, it's truly interdisciplinary. The sources really stress that.
And the evidence they mention is pretty specific. Flint tools, hunting, fishing, sites in Scania going back over 14,000 years.
And get this, imported seal bones found way inland, dating back maybe 11,000 years. That suggests they already had access to the open sea somehow, long before what we think of as proper seafaring.
Wow. Okay, and the Mesolithic, the Bronze period, the sources paint a picture of a pretty tough existence.
Definitely. High mortality.
Yeah.
People living right on the edge, constantly adapting. And then later in the pre-Roman Iron Age, you start seeing things like cremated remains in pots, changes in beliefs, burial practices. As archaeology tells us so much.
All right, let's jump forward quite a bit to an era everyone's heard of. The Viking Age, roughly 800 to 1050 AD.
Yep, this is the big expansion period. Danes, Norwegians, Swedes pushing outwards. And that's when they got the name Vikings, largely because of their skills at sea and, let's be honest, their fearsome reputation.
What was driving it all? The sources point to a mix, right? Unrest back home, population pressure, maybe needing resources.
A desire for wealth, for status, all of that. So they took to the seas in those amazing long ships.
And they weren't just exploring, they were raiding coasts, rivers, anywhere they could reach for plunder.
Lindisfarne Monastery. England, 793 AD. That's the classic example, often seen as the start of the whole era, at least in the popular imagination.
But it wasn't just smash and grab, was it? They were settlers too.
Absolutely. By the mid-800s, Scandinavians had settled Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and in Britain, the Danes established the Danelaw, a huge territory centered on York. Real influence.
And the interactions weren't always violent. The sources mentioned trade, too.
Yeah, like the Baltic fur trade with Finns and Karelians, peaceful exchange. But then you also had conflict, like clashes with Estonians over those same trade routes. It was complicated.
Even Danes raiding southern Sweden around 800 AD. The sources link that to controlling the Baltic fur trade for Western markets. So violence and trade were tangled up.
Definitely. And back in Denmark itself, big changes were happening. Cities started to form, trading centers, power centers.
And crucially, the move towards Christianity began. The end of the Viking Age, late 10th, early 11th century, is really tied up with Christianization and unifying the kingdom.
Our knowledge for this time comes from archaeology, mostly settlements, burials, treasure hoards, but also written accounts from Europeans who met them, though, those accounts are often biased by fear.
Understandable. And they established bases, right? Trading posts, military footholds.
Yep, especially along the North Sea coast. But their reach was incredible. The Baltic, Isle of Man, Ireland, even hints of presence down near Spain.
Okay, so coming out of the Viking Age, we're into the medieval period. By around 1500, the basic shape of Denmark is forming, built on those much earlier tribal groups.
Right. Alliances formed, small kingdoms emerged, and eventually they coalesced into the Kingdom of Denmark. though it wasn't always stable. The sources mention divisions, like between Jelling and Skjoldung's kingdoms, an unstable balance.
But there were also times when Denmark was dominant in Scandinavia, right?
Yeah.
Danish hegemony.
Yes, definitely periods of that. Some key things the sources highlight from this era. The Jelling stones are huge. Not just monuments, but statements of power by rulers like Harold Bluetooth, showing their embrace of Christianity, maybe even referencing conflicts with groups like the Russian Varangians.
And the kingdom itself was divided internally.
Yeah, into Jutland, Zealand, Skåne. And you see key figures emerging, like Bishop Absalon founding Copenhagen after Lund became the archdiocese. Lund Cathedral itself becomes really important.
And the church's role after Christianization around 1100?
Well, foreign church officials came in, but the sources emphasize that Denmark managed to sort of nationalize church power. The church became more subordinate to the king.
So canon law, the church's law, actually helped the king.
Paradoxically, yes. It gave the king more leverage within his own realm relative to the church hierarchy. Papal power was important institutionally for things like missions or crusades, but maybe less so personally for individual kings, according to the source. And monasteries, with their land and rules, became part of the picture too.
Now, something interesting happens later, around the 13th century. The Scandinavian kingdoms start moving closer again.
Yeah, after a period of maybe focusing elsewhere. Two big reasons, the sources say. One, German expansionism in the Baltic. An external threat.
And the other?
Internal instability. Royal power was actually quite fragile. A few hundred armed men could challenge a king, so constant strife. This led the royal families to intermarry, looking for alliances and support. That paved the way for the Kalmar Union later on.
And there were specific events triggering this.
The sources mention the murder of King Erik Klipping in 1286. Danish nobles fled to Norway, pulling Norway into the mess. Sweden had its own succession problems. Denmark got squeezed. Norwegians and their Danish allies held parts of Halland, raided Denmark.
Sounds chaotic.
It was. King Erik Menved's wars drained the treasury, leading to a kind of collapse. The Norwegian king, Magnus Eriksson, who also became king of Sweden for a time, actually bought Skåne, Halland, and Bleking.
He just bought them?
Bought them from the Holstein counts who held them as collateral, yeah. Eventually, the Norway-Sweden Union fell apart in the 1350s, and that's when Valdemar Atterdag rose to power, reunified Denmark, and crucially, took back those Skåne lands.
Okay, the sources also mention Valdemar II, the victorious. Though it seems a bit out of place chronologically in the material we saw, that's definitely medieval history, though.
Right, reigning early 13th century. Lots of military actions, especially trying to expand into the South Baltic.
Mixed results, it sounds like.
Pretty mixed. Some early gains in Pomerania, but then losses like Bornholm. The big turning point was the defeat at Bornhoft in 1237 against German forces. After that, major expansion was off the table.
And he even thought about raiding England to pay debts. Echoes of the Vikings.
Apparently so. The threat was real enough for England to notice. But he died in 1241, and the large-scale threat faded. Though interestingly, Danish ships did keep raiding England into the late 1240s. Old habits die hard, maybe.
So ultimately, the sources suggest all this foreign adventuring and internal problems stopped any chance of uniting with England, leaving England to consolidate while Denmark fell into civil unrest after his death.
That seems to be the takeaway, which leads us towards the next major upheaval, the Reformation.
The sources set this up as following a period where the Catholic Church became firmly established in Denmark, sort of 1420 to 1520.
And a key moment highlighted is translating the Bible into Danish. Hugely important. Not just religious, but culturally unifying. Makes the scripture accessible to everyone.
And the king played a big role in pushing the new church.
Absolutely. The sources mention a really specific royal edict trying to boost church building and make the church central to daily life, even regulating market stall locations relative to churches.
Wow. So while the sources have some fragmented bits about specific bishops or disputes, the main point is this huge religious shift, driven significantly by the monarchy establishing a new state church.
Exactly. Which brings us neatly to the Age of Absolute Monarchy, kicking off formally in 1660. A massive change in how the state worked.
The sources pinpoint the second resolution of 1660. This is King Frederick III basically saying, no more power sharing with the old councils.
Right. He sets up a direct administration. Civil officials, maybe even some old council members, but they reported directly to him. That's the formal start of political absolutism.
Though the sources suggest the actual power shift might not have been instantly earth-shattering.
Perhaps not overnight in practice, but the formal structure was new. Theoretical absolutism. The idea pushed was unity, the state held together by the monarch, There's even an anecdote about a king defining monarchy in a catechism, linking it to God and philosophy.
Contrasting with how classical ideas sometimes fueled revolts elsewhere.
Exactly. Frederick III really cemented this hereditary absolute monarchy kind of French style. The sources give little hints of the politics, public opinion shifting, ministers trying to keep things secret but failing, counselors who resisted being removed.
And the church gets pulled right into this absolute state.
Totally integrated. Frederick III introduced the Danish evangelical church. Church, king, law, all united. It was reformed internally, then locked into the political system. Interestingly, the sources say a small group established this state church, maybe partly against popular wishes, but circumstances helped them.
This era also saw big wars, right? The Great Northern War.
A major one.
Yeah.
The sources lay out the context. Long rivalry with Sweden, land, sea, bad blood from earlier Swedish conquests in southern Denmark, a race for dominance.
And religious differences probably playing a part too.
Likely. Denmark wanted territory back in northern Germany. Sweden wanted to cement its Baltic control, grab Danish harbors.
And the outcome?
Both got drawn into fighting Russia. Denmark had to concede, lost key harbors to Sweden. Russia gained territory like Ladonia. Denmark looked isolated for a bit, but the sources say it regained importance later. There's also a quick mention of Queen Christina of Sweden's ambitions, but her campaigns apparently came to nothing much.
Okay, jumping ahead to the 19th century, now we see a real focus on Danish national identity emerging.
Yes, the sources mention the fosterland love and law of the fatherland. This idea that Danishness needed to include everyone speaking Danish, especially the populations down in Schleswig and Holstein. They were seen as the core of the Danish soul.
Which immediately raises a huge, difficult question, doesn't it?
Right there in the sources. Would Denmark try to force assimilation? Impose the Danish language? The feeling hinted at is that maybe it was too late for this sick fatherland, as they put it.
And the political scene was fragmented, old parties gone.
Pretty much. Older Danish dialects survived in rural spots, among minorities in Holstein. It was a real struggle, shedding old languages, adopting new national customs. And the sources note Denmark seemed to have less peace than the rest of the German monarchies at the time, enacting specific laws under the Queen.
Then comes the real tragedy of the century for Denmark, the War of 1864.
A defining moment. Prussia and Austria tightening their grip on Schleswig and Holstein. Denmark's traditional balancing act of alliances and neutrality was under immense pressure.
The government tried to react.
They met at Sora, discussed defense. A defense association was formed, trying to rally civil support, even challenging state committees. From the Danish view, presented in the sources, it was the Danish war for Danish full power over those duchies. Voices from Schleswig were seen as critical.
But divisions were deep.
Very. Prohibition against German-leaning areas, meetings to strengthen ties with the locals, ethnic Danes there knew, damaging the chance for a shared culture was costly. But the political winds were shifting. Germans in the duchies formed their own groups, becoming more conservative, more aggressive before the war.
And the war itself.
Swift and brutal. People donated money, journalists, artists for the cause, even for potential legal costs afterwards. It exposed the government's weakness, the feebleness as the source calls it. German language seen as poison. Fragmented, sad stories hinted at seafarers' fates, accusations. The war was lost quickly.
Such a painful period. And amidst this, major constitutional reforms were happening too.
Back in 1847, King Frederick VII wasn't keen on the big changes the national liberals wanted. The sources call it a Gordian knot. The push for a free constitution was tied directly to the national demand for Denmark to the Elbe, incorporating the duchies.
And these liberals, what was their goal? Not necessarily democracy.
The sources suggest maybe more like ethnocracy in the late 1840s rule based on ethnicity. And remember, absolute monarchy was already gone in Norway since 1814, though that's often overlooked.
So the June Constitution of 1849, a big step.
Huge. Legislative power shared between king and parliament. Executive power stays with the king. He loses his spot chairing the Supreme Court, but keeps pardon power. Shared lawmaking, but he enforces laws. Can dissolve parliament. Laws need parliaments okay.
Less revolutionary than Norway's, the sources say.
That's the characterization. And the king's actual political responsibility was limited in practice. Legal limits eroded quickly by later laws.
Then comes the 1866 Constitution, a step backwards.
In substance, yes, according to the sources. Described as basically reintroducing absolute monarchy, but with a constitutional disguise. 4 chambers brought back.
Parliament becomes 2 houses, bicameral, and voting rights.
Definitely not general suffrage. Men,
Huh?
25-29 excluded. And critically, an income requirement for voting in the upper house, the Landsting. Unequal suffrage explicitly brought in for the Landsting in 1866. More power to the wealthy.
Which leads the sources to make a really strong point.
Yeah, they call the idea that democracy arrived fully in 1849 a myth. The key figures behind it, according to this material, did not want what we'd call democracy today, a really important nuance about Denmark's path.
Okay, into the 20th century, World War I, Denmark stays out.
Strict neutrality. There was a close call in 1917, a diplomatic spat with the Allies pushed them near the edge, but the sources say nobody really wanted to force Denmark in, so neutrality held.
Public opinion was firmly against joining.
Overwhelmingly. Fear of getting dragged in, desire to stay neutral, they managed it, despite the uncertainty.
But the war still had impacts at home.
Oh yeah. The suffrage movement gained steam in 1918. Elections of certain committees. Financially, printing money doubled the supply. And after the war, economic problems, social issues resurfaced, leading to immediate strikes.
The sources seem to link the mood after WWI to the lead-up to WWII.
They do, highlighting the huge hope after WWI, Versailles, Wilson's ideas, League of Nations, real optimism for peace.
But it didn't last.
Not for the less naive observers, the sources say. Hopes faded in the 20s. Rise of fascism, Nazism in the 30s. Appeasement just delayed the inevitable. Hard for people who hadn't lived through WWI to grasp, the sources suggest.
Economically, though, WWI wasn't all bad for Denmark.
The merchant fleet did well, working mostly with British interests. Farmers exporting dairy and cattle to Britain also prospered.
Then comes April 9th, 1940. World War II arrives dramatically.
German attacks. Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht. An ultimatum, apparently threat of bombing within minutes, echoing a 1913 document. Chilling.
And Denmark didn't fight back initially.
Capitulated very quickly. No real military resistance. The sources state this was actually part of a plan, hoping to preserve independence long term. Germany, meanwhile, had plans ready for taking Norway and Denmark.
So the invasion was swift.
Very. German fleet hit the ports. The first German commander died quickly, which the sources say surprised the incredibly naive Danes. It leads the sources to ask why and how it happened so fast, mentioning this historical Germany connection influencing Danish policy.
After the occupation started, resistance wasn't immediate.
Initial orders to resist were quickly overridden by the German advance. There was a huge public reaction, but organized resistance took time to build, though the sources mention an early symbolic act like the German consul being blown up in 1941.
But resistance did grow.
It did and became effective, which led to harsher German responses, mass arrests. What happened in Norway was a clear warning.
Interestingly, the sources mention a sort of informal understanding the first few months.
Yeah, a kind of scorched earth, rapid silence, less control approach that maybe suited both sides initially. Minimizing overt conflict, keeping administration going, peaceful negotiation seemed possible. Incidents were kept small-scale, less police involvement at first.
And pacifists focused just on preservation.
According to the sources, yes. Preserving what Denmark had, not trying to change events, censorship, limited outside knowledge. There's also a note about Allied warships letting neutral ships pass, giving a brief sense of liberation.
The sources also have these scattered details: Finland attacking the USSR, Danish naval stuff, a B-25 sinking a ship, officials being humiliated. Hard to piece together fully from the text provided.
Yeah, they're presented a bit disjointedly, but they hint at the complex reality of occupation. The main story remains. Quick surrender, growing resistance, increasing German harshness.
Okay, post-war, a big shift. Denmark is no longer neutral.
Right, from 1945. The Soviets were apparently suspicious, sources say they took hold of Denmark against their wishes, but also ensured no red menace against the West.
Denmark's new role, supporting Allied bases.
Kind of a remote officers' corps, as the source puts it, for U.S. Allied bases. But crucially, no large nuclear weapons on Danish soil. That was the condition. The sources also briefly mention Allied intelligence being wary of certain Danish figures seen as pro-German.
Now, here's that really unusual point from the sources.
Yes. The claim that the U.S. raided Denmark in 1949 because it had become Sovietized and part of the Iron Curtain. It even mentions British planes over tender.
Which sounds very contradictory to Denmark joining NATO in 1949 and getting Marshall Plan aid.
Extremely. But that's what the source material provided states. We have to flag it as a claim made in these specific sources, acknowledging how it differs from the standard historical narrative. It's quite striking phrasing.
Okay. Shifting to the economy after the war. Recovery drivers.
Cold War dynamics helped. Marshall Plan was huge. Wiped out German economic dominance too. Denmark joined the OEC early, got loans, grants.
And on the ground,
Intense activity. Trucks, tractors, agriculture going full tilt, potatoes, grain, dairy. That agricultural base, the raw material treadmill, the source calls it, was the foundation for decades of recovery. The Scandinavian model emerges. Agriculture and industry linked, though farming later got blamed when industry hit bumps in the 60s.
The sources break down the growth phases.
Yeah, growth 47-51, restructuring 52-57, then intensification 57-65. Modern farming led the charge.
And this economic base allowed for major social reforms starting around 1965.
Exactly. Driven by the push for universal, non-contributory old-age pensions and free school milk. That opened the floodgates for other reforms.
The pension reform aimed at fixing inadequate existing ones.
Yes, providing real security for low-income elderly, funded publicly based on income limits. A move towards a universal safety net.
And healthcare changes.
A new insurance scheme in 1960 covering 50% of doctor costs outside hospitals. Expanded coverage. Investment in health centers, hospitals. Plans even started for free medical treatment for everyone. Very ambitious.
These reforms happened quickly after a Social Democrat win in '61.
Rolled out fast. Some felt too late. Often, legislative drafts came straight from the finance ministry, debated, then passed, even with opposition agreements sometimes.
Working conditions, too. Less hours dealing with night work.
Plans for that were also part of it. The sources mentioned some political friction, allies feeling the opposition blocked debate, bills passing via majority rules. Social press criticized the Social Democrats. Minority parties felt they could expose mistakes, but the ruling party could often push things through.
Okay, which brings us to Denmark and the EU. A complex relationship, the sources say.
Definitely. Joined the EC back in '73, became EU with Maastricht in '93. But involvement in these supranational bodies has always been controversial there. A lot of hesitation.
Why the reticence?
Deep pride in their long history of democracy and nationhood. The fact their 1849 constitution is still largely in place. Some see that as a weakness, others as a strength, something fundamental you don't mess with.
A feeling that giving power away weakens democracy itself.
That's a core concern for many. And within Denmark, different views. Some want active participation, shaping the EU. Others worry it dilutes Danish society's uniformity. Still, others feel the EU isn't demanding enough of its members.
And recent trends show declining support.
Significantly down, yes. Yeah. The sources use the word panic among EU officials, clear sign of ongoing public skepticism.
The journey to joining was gradual, started with EFTA.
Yeah, the European Free Trade Association in 1960. Denmark joined. Parliament okayed the rules in '61. They even applied for EEC membership then, tied to Britain's stance on agriculture.
But the first referendum failed.
Lost in '63. 56.5% no. Negotiations were tough. Parliament struggled with concessions, but the possibility of opt-outs, negotiated earlier, was seen as serious bargaining by the EEC.
Danes were used to flexibility, the sources suggest.
Yeah, informal flexibility. So the idea of common EEC info wasn't alien. Flexibility across borders seemed possible. But the bottom line, stated in the sources, was a real loss of national sovereignty over laws, taxes, welfare.
So they joined the EC in '73, EU in '93. Maastricht Treaty was the key, but controversial. The first referendum failed in '92.
Which led to the Edinburgh Accords in '93. Not treaty changes, but clarifications negotiated by the PM to address the no-vote concerns. That allowed ratification in a second referendum.
What did the Accords include?
Things like a looser definition of citizen of the Union, a protocol clarifying competences, and the big one, exemption from supranational defense cooperation, common defense. Opt-outs were written into protocols like the UK-Ireland Euro ones.
And constitutional changes were needed along the way?
3 changes between 1849 and 1953 paved the way for integration. Denmark's used opt-outs more than anyone. It's a constant debate, especially after recent EU elections. And the collapse of ETA was a big reason they pursued EEC membership seriously.
All right, let's look at contemporary Denmark. Post-WWII, stable, peaceful, egalitarian is the picture painted.
And famous as a welfare state. High taxes, funding, free healthcare, free university, generous parental leave, unemployment insurance, universalism, equality, public provision, free at the point of use, often without means testing.
But that model is under scrutiny now.
Increasingly, yes. Sources mention downsizing, public sector staff seen as expensive, or services inadequate, customer dissatisfaction. So a new focus on value for money, exploring privatization, quasi-public models with multiple suppliers. Though the sources stress, there's still strong underlying support for public provision itself.
And society transformed dramatically in the 50s and 60s.
Huge shift from agricultural to modern industrial society. People moved to cities, new suburbs, grew up co-op housing, rented flats, big changes in how people lived.
Politically, constitutional monarchy, parliamentary system, government officials work for parliament, seen as working well, low corruption.
Diverse parties, but mostly center-left, center-right dominance historically.
Culturally, international influence is there, but Danes value their own language culture, proud of the Viking past.
And the sources delve into religious history again. Christianity arrived early Middle Ages. Relics show local variations, not just Latin forms. Grave mounds with crosses show the transition. Runic stones hint at pagan beliefs lingering.
Church buildings evolved from simple wood peat to stone landmarks like Lund. Preaching inside or out that caused conflict after the Reformation, authorities trying to control who preachers addressed.
Visual arts carried the Christian message too. Wax tablets, paint. Late Middle Ages saw biblical scenes mixed with local tales, allegories.
The Reformation hit this art hard.
Almost wiped it out, the sources say. Early Baroque art, later, was anti-Catholic. No saints, focus on settings, plain costumes. 18th century saw official calls to renew imagery, but money was slow. Mandates spread art, sometimes called propaganda as a sailing gallery. Local artists in country parishes painted altarpieces, murals, sometimes surprisingly with Virgin Mary or Old Testament themes.
Back to politics. The kingdom includes Greenland, Faroe Islands with self-government, parliamentary monarchy, Dutch-inspired structure. 1849 led to cabinet system. 1901 brought proportional representation, coalition governments became normal. 1953 Constitution made the legislature unicameral, just the folketing.
How Parliament works. Government proposes laws. Fixed speaking time per party, opposition gets specific slots. Time allocated democratically within parties. Control mechanisms. Question time. Access to government minutes.
Access to information is good.
Considered high. Laws regulate access to documents, Freedom of Information Act, even access to party meeting minutes via another act. Generally low corruption, but cases happen. Civil service increasingly digital, helps youth engagement.
Social issues. Denmark is multicultural despite its size. Integration is seen as a state responsibility.
Crucial for the welfare state's sustainability, the sources emphasize, providing opportunities, education, jobs, good life.
Integration policy started mid-80s, cross-party support initially. Mass immigration is relatively recent, though.
Yeah, 40, 50 years for older non-Western groups, much less for others. Makes measuring long-term results tricky. Younger immigrant generations are doing better than parents, but a gap remains compared to ethnic Danes their age. The debate gets heated. Claims the government did nothing for years are untrue, sources say. Lots of resources invested locally and nationally.
Key reports led to policy changes.
A 2003 report found the 80s policy wasn't enough, recommended a new approach. Reform made municipalities responsible for integrating newcomers. New chance for integration focused on early action, immigrant responsibility, simpler admin. Recent governments focused on, well, the source mentions abandonment, which is unclear. But positive trends noted, more training jobs, younger immigrants doing better educationally, though group differences persist. A recent Blue Book calls for deeper analysis of the gaps and policies for equal transitions.
Okay, finally, Denmark's global influence, often seen now as small, successful, happy.
But the sources argue it was historically a global superpower, a major contributor. Danish expansion in the Age of Exploration created one of Europe's largest empires, they claim.
Maritime power made it dominant over neighbors, preeminent in the 17th century, active colonially in the 18th.
That's the assertion in the sources, highlighting its role in Iceland and Greenland's development, and this really striking claim about North America.
That Denmark pioneered recognizing Native American rights there and established the first modern democracy on the continent before the U.S.
That's the claim made in the material, yes. Quite something.
And contributions to arts, science, literature over 300 years, defending smaller nations' interests.
All part of this picture of a significant historical power, aware of its empire status, memorials preserving that memory, attracting tourists today.
Tourism is big despite the small population, natural beauty, history.
Renaissance towns, islands, landscapes. And literature sources even suggest the most Nobel candidates per capita, mentioning Anderson, playwrights, oddly Karl Marx, implying a deep cultural wellspring. Viking sites offer insight into that turbulent past. Memorials to figures like Tycho Brahe, Arne Jacobsen.
So wrapping up this huge deep dive, the sources offer some really provocative final thoughts on Danish identity.
Yes, suggesting that talking about the colonial past might ruffle national vanity, arguing that the pride of those dark days of empire is maybe hard for today's generation to connect with.
And then this incredibly bold assertion, Denmark as the nucleus of the Scandinavian Empire.
The only place where power was truly unified, they claim. Norway and Sweden never holding together independently before Denmark's influence.
And colonization of Iceland, Greenland, Vinland described as wholly Danish. Denmark as where the cultured world first awoke. Strong stuff.
Very strong. And a poetic image of Denmark's pre-American explorer history being matted like a swamp with heroes and rivers, deep, complex, maybe murky.
Contrasting the grand Viking image with the idea that the ordinary Dane's imagination didn't necessarily picture their gods in more splendor than their own reality, maybe suggesting a kind of groundedness despite the history.
Perhaps. And the final point the sources leave us with. For a long time, Nordland and Denmark were seen together in Europe, an inseparable force that moved the projectable world. A powerful closing image.
Wow, okay. That was quite a journey. Millennia covered. From Ice Age settlers and farmers, through Vikings, kingdom formation, Reformation, absolutism, that difficult 19th century world wars, building the welfare state, grappling with the EU, modern multiculturalism.
It really throws into sharp relief that constant interplay between internal development and external forces, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And hearing those claims from the sources about its past as an empire, the nucleus is Scandinavia, it certainly makes you think about historical self-perception.
Absolutely. So the question to leave you with, thinking about this long, complex history marked by power, vulnerability, unity, conflict, how does Denmark today balance that deep sense of its own unique identity with globalization, integration, modern challenges? What does this whole epic journey tell us about how nations endure, adapt, and change over thousands of years? Definitely something to ponder.